What if the most feared overseers on a plantation began vanishing, one by one, without a trace? And what if the only person who could have done it was the one man they had tortured beyond human endurance? This isn't just a story of revenge. This is the story of Devil's White. Between 1853 and 1854, a silent terror gripped the plantations along Georgia's Ojibwe River. 9 white overseers simply disappeared. The official records tell a neat, clean lie: they relocated, they moved west. But in the slave quarters of Burke County, a different story was whispered. A story about a pale figure who moved through the cypress groves like a ghost. A story about screams that echoed and then were silenced. And a story about what was found curing in the deep swamp: human skin, stretched like leather. The enslaved called him Devil's White. And they knew a secret the plantation owners would kill to keep buried. Before we uncover what really happened in those swamps, I need to ask you something. If you're listening to this, you need to be part of this channel. Subscribe to The Final Fear and leave a comment telling me what state you're listening from. I read every single one. Now, let's go back to where the nightmare began. The Calhoun Plantation was a place of pure brutality, and Thomas Grier was its master of pain. He believed his control was absolute. That was his first mistake. His second was underestimating the silent, albino slave named Silas. When Silas arrived, his white skin and pink eyes marked him as an outcast. Grier saw a broken man to be crushed. He assigned him to the deadly rice fields, where the sun blistered his skin and the water festered his wounds. When Silas worked too slowly, Grier used the whip. But he noticed something that should have terrified him: Silas never made a sound. Not a scream, not a whimper. Just a chilling, focused silence. While the overseers slept, Silas was learning the swamp. He was mapping the cypress groves, a maze of dark water and hidden sinkholes where a man could vanish forever. The other slaves saw him disappear into the darkness and return before dawn. They knew something was coming. They felt it in the air, a tension like a drawn bowstring. Then, the vanishings began. First, it was Wade Parsons. He was just gone. His cabin was undisturbed, his rifle left behind, a half-eaten meal gone cold on the table. A search found nothing. No body, no struggle. As if the earth had swallowed him whole. Panic began to spread among the overseers. They started traveling in pairs, their eyes darting into the shadows. It didn't matter. 3 weeks later, another one vanished in broad daylight. Then 2 more on the same night, their rifles found neatly leaned against a tree, as if placed there by a careful hand. 7 men were now gone. The plantation was descending into chaos. The remaining overseers were prisoners in their own fear, and the enslaved watched, knowing that a reckoning was underway. Driven by fury and fear, Grier finally snapped. He dragged Silas in and tortured him for hours with whips and hot irons, demanding a confession. But Silas gave them nothing. No screams, no answers. Just that same, unnerving silence. He was a man who had learned to turn his body into a fortress against pain. That very night, the 2 overseers who had participated in the torture vanished from their posts, leaving their weapons behind. The message was clear: your violence means nothing. Your rules no longer apply. The next morning, the social order of the plantation was dead. The enslaved did not go to the fields. The overseers were barricaded in the main house, outnumbered and terrified. And Silas was gone from the quarters. Grier, in one last, desperate gamble, took a young enslaved guide and his last guard into the cypress grove, following the path Silas had walked so many times. What they found in a hidden clearing was a vision from their deepest nightmares. A framework of cypress wood stood in the center, and from it hung 9 human skins, preserved and displayed like trophies. It was all the missing men. This was no simple killing. This was a statement. And then, from the shadows, Silas emerged. He moved with a speed that defied his tortured body. The guard died before he could fire a shot. Grier ran, crashing through the swamp in a blind panic, but he was in Silas's world now. In the darkness, he felt a touch on his shoulder. He turned, and saw those pale, pitiless eyes. The next morning, Jeremiah Calhoun, the plantation owner, opened his door to a horrifying sight. The entire enslaved population was gathered, watching silently as Silas walked out of the swamp. He carried a bundle, which he laid at Calhoun's feet. It was the head of Thomas Greer. The plantation was finished. The fear had been turned back on its masters. Silas looked at Calhoun, not with rage, but with cold finality, and spoke the truth that would echo through history: this plantation operated on fear. Now you understand what real fear feels like. In the sweltering summer of 1853 Georgia, whispers began to spread through the plantations. They said there was a man with skin as pale as moonlight, ice cold as ash, and a rage hotter than hellfire itself. They called him Devil's White. Born different, cursed by those who saw him as an omen, he endured cruelty no human soul should ever face. But one night, something inside him snapped. By dawn, 9 overseers were gone, and the earth of Georgia would never sleep quietly again. This is the legend of the albino slave who took vengeance, a story buried deep in the South's forgotten past, until now. He then turned and walked back into the swamp, vanishing forever into legend. But the story doesn't end there. What was the training in his past that gave him the knowledge to do such a thing? And is it possible that Devil's White never really left those Georgia swamps? The darkness of history holds its secrets tight, but we will never stop digging. Between 1853 and 1854, along the Ogechee River corridor in southeastern Georgia, 9 white overseers vanished from their plantations. The vanishings were never reported in local newspapers. In county records, each man was listed as having simply relocated or moved west. But a different truth was whispered in the slave quarters of Burke County. They told stories of a pale figure moving through the darkness, of screams echoing from cypress groves, and of skin discovered stretched and curing like leather in hidden places deep within the swamps. Devil's White was the name the enslaved population gave him, a name spoken only in the quietest moments when overseers were far from earshot. According to official records, these men simply left Georgia for opportunities elsewhere. But the enslaved people who lived through those 18 months knew better. Before we continue with the story of Devil's White and the terror that gripped the plantations of Burke County, I need to ask you something important. If you're listening to this story, take a moment to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We want to know where our audience is discovering these forgotten American horrors. Now, let's return to the nightmare that began in the autumn of 1853. In the early 1850s, Burke County, Georgia, was a landscape of brutal contradictions. Dense forests of cypress and tupelo were carved through by the Ogechee River, creating a maze of swamps and tributaries that planters had learned to harness for rice cultivation. The county sat in the heart of Georgia's Black Belt, where in some districts, enslaved people outnumbered white residents by margins of 10-1. The uplands were ruled by cotton, the land swamps were dominated by rice, and human bondage made both possible. Across 3,000 acres of this unforgiving terrain stretched the Calhoun Plantation. From his father in 1847, Jeremiah Calhoun had inherited the property, along with 237 enslaved people whose names appeared in his ledgers as mere livestock entries. Calhoun himself rarely visited the property, preferring his Savannah townhouse, where he could maintain the social standing expected of Georgia's planter class and conduct his business. The actual management of his property fell to a succession of overseers, white men typically drawn from the poor farming class who saw the position as their one opportunity to exercise power over others. On the Calhoun plantation, the work was killing work. Rice cultivation required enslaved people to stand in water up to their waists for hours, their legs swelling from constant immersion, their hands bleeding from handling the sharp stalks. With such regularity, dysentery, cholera, and malaria swept through the slave quarters that Calhoun budgeted for the annual loss of human property the way other planters budgeted for equipment replacement. The overseers who managed this nightmare were expected to extract maximum productivity regardless of human cost, and they were given absolute authority to achieve that goal through any means they deemed necessary. In October of 1853, an enslaved man arrived at the Calhoun plantation under unusual circumstances. The county records list him only as property transfer, male, 28, albino, field hand, origin, Chatham County. He had no recorded name in any official document. The enslaved community would come to call him Silas, though whether this was a name he chose or one given to him remains unknown. His appearance was what made Silas remarkable, and what would ultimately make him legendary. Complete albinism was rare among any population, but among enslaved Africans, it created a particularly cruel set of circumstances. Silas's skin held no melanin whatsoever. It was pale as candle wax, prone to burning and blistering under the Georgia sun. His eyes were a washed-out blue that watered constantly in daylight, forcing him to squint against illumination that other workers tolerated easily. His hair grew white and fine, nothing like the coarse dark hair typical of his people. This appearance had marked him as cursed or touched by something unnatural in the eyes of both enslaved and enslaver populations throughout his life. The records from Chatham County that accompanied his transfer were sparse but revealing. Silas had been sold 4 times in the previous 6 years, always after incidents the records described only as difficulties with management or unsuitability for cooperative labor. One notation from 1851 was more specific: subject displays extreme resistance to correction. Previous owner reports 2 overseers injured during discipline attempts. Recommends sale to interior plantation where isolation can be maintained. The head overseer at the Calhoun plantation was Thomas Grier, a man whose reputation preceded him throughout Burke County. At 43 years old, he had spent 2 decades managing enslaved labor across Georgia and South Carolina. He was known for what the planter class euphemistically called firm management, a term that concealed regular beatings, the torture of those who worked too slowly, and sexual violence against enslaved women that produced a generation of mixed-race children he never acknowledged. Grier lived in a house near the main plantation buildings, a structure far superior to the slave quarters but still modest compared to the main house that Jeremiah Calhoun occupied during his infrequent visits. To help manage the plantation's operations, Grier employed 8 assistant overseers. These men came from similar backgrounds to Grier himself, poor whites who had grown up farming small plots, men who saw overseeing as their opportunity to rise above the poverty they'd been born into. They ranged in age from 22 to 51, and they shared a worldview shaped by the brutal social hierarchies of the antebellum South. They understood that their position depended on maintaining absolute control over the enslaved population, and they enforced that control through calculated violence. When Silas arrived at the Calhoun plantation in late October, the assistant overseers responded to his appearance with immediate derision. One of them, a man named Wade Parsons, declared that Silas looked like something that crawled out of hell wearing the wrong skin. Another, Robert Finch, suggested that his pale appearance made him touched by the devil and predicted he wouldn't last a month in the rice fields. With mixed reactions, the enslaved population observed Silas. Some viewed his condition with superstitious fear, others with the weary sympathy of people who understood what it meant to be marked as different in a world that punished difference without mercy. Thomas Grier assigned Silas to the rice fields, the most physically demanding and dangerous work on the plantation. The rice grew in fields that had been cleared from swampland, creating paddies that had to be flooded and drained according to the crop's growth cycle. Enslaved workers spent their days bent over in ankle-deep to waist-deep water, planting, weeding, and eventually harvesting rice under a sun that turned the landscape into a steam bath by midday. For someone with Silas's condition, this assignment was particularly brutal. His skin, unable to produce protective melanin, burned and blistered within hours of sun exposure. The constant water immersion caused his skin to crack and peel, creating wounds that refused to heal in the humid environment. With satisfaction rather than concern, Grier watched Silas's suffering. In his view, the albino slave's pain was justice for whatever defiance had led to his multiple sales. When Silas worked more slowly than other enslaved people, struggling with vision problems and physical pain, Grier responded with the whip. The first beating occurred during Silas's 3rd day at the plantation when he failed to complete his assigned section of the rice field before sunset. Grier had him tied to a post near the slave quarters and delivered 20 lashes while the other enslaved workers were forced to watch, a standard technique meant to reinforce the consequences of inadequate productivity. Something that should have warned Grier was what he noticed during that first beating: Silas made no sound. Most people being whipped screamed, begged, or at least grunted with each strike. Silas remained silent, his pale eyes fixed on some distant point beyond Grier's shoulder. When it was finished and he was cut down, Silas walked back to his quarters without limping or showing any sign of pain, though his back was striped with bleeding welts. The other enslaved people whispered about this afterward, noting that someone who could endure such punishment without crying out was someone to watch carefully. The routine of plantation life continued through November and into December of 1853. The weather turned colder, which brought some relief to Silas's sun-damaged skin but introduced new miseries in the form of freezing water in the rice paddies. The workday began before dawn and continued until after sunset, with only brief breaks for meals of cornmeal and whatever vegetables the enslaved people could grow in their small garden plots. The overseers maintained control through constant surveillance and random violence, ensuring that fear remained the dominant emotional reality for the enslaved population. During these weeks, several enslaved people noticed that Silas sometimes disappeared during the brief hours between the end of work and the required return to quarters. No one knew where he went, though some reported seeing his pale figure moving toward the cypress groves that bordered the plantation's rice fields. These groves were dangerous territory, dense, swampy areas filled with cottonmouth snakes and alligators, places where even experienced woodsmen could become disoriented and lost. The fact that Silas ventured into these areas alone and always returned suggested either recklessness or an intimate knowledge of swamp navigation that seemed impossible for someone who had only recently arrived at the plantation. Christmas week brought a brief respite from labor, a tradition that most planters observed to maintain the illusion of paternalistic benevolence. The enslaved people received slightly better rations, a few hours of permitted celebration, and a temporary reduction in supervision. It was during this period that an enslaved woman named Delilah had a conversation with Silas that she would remember for the rest of her life. Delilah was 52 years old, a cook who worked in the plantation's main kitchen and had survived 3 decades of bondage through careful observation and strategic silence. She found Silas sitting alone near the quarters, his pale skin stark against the darkness. "They say you've been sold 4 times before coming here," Delilah said, settling herself on the ground near him. "They say you got troubles with overseers wherever you go." Silas didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and measured. "Troubles find me. I don't go looking for them. That man, Greer," Delilah continued. "He's the worst kind. He'll kill you slow if you give him reason. I seen him do it before. There was a man 3 years back, field hand named Joseph, who talked back once. Greer had him beaten so bad he died 2 days later. Didn't matter to Mr. Calhoun. He just bought another slave to replace him." "I know what Greer is," Silas said. His pale eyes caught the moonlight, giving them an eerie, reflective quality. "I know what all of them are." "And then you best keep your head down," Delilah advised. "Whatever you thinking about doing, whatever anger you carrying, you got to bury it deep. Anger gets us killed." Silas turned to look at her fully for the first time. Maybe anger is the only thing that keeps us alive. The conversation ended there, but Delilah would later testify that she felt a chill run through her body as he spoke those words, a sensation she couldn't explain but couldn't shake. The first disappearance occurred on January 7, 1854. Wade Parsons, one of the assistant overseers, failed to appear for the morning assembly of enslaved workers. This was unusual because Parsons was known for his punctuality and his enthusiasm for the first beating of the day, which he considered essential for establishing the proper tone of fear and submission. When Parsons didn't appear by mid-morning, Thomas Greer sent another overseer, a man named Benjamin Strickland, to check Parsons's cabin. Strickland found the cabin empty. The bed was unmade, and Parsons's coat still hung on its peg near the door, suggesting he hadn't planned to go far. His rifle, which he normally carried everywhere, leaned against the wall. A half-eaten meal sat on the table, the food cold and untouched for hours. Nothing suggested violence or struggle. Parsons simply wasn't there. Greer organized a search party that included 3 other overseers and a group of enslaved men he considered trustworthy enough to assist without attempting escape. They combed the plantation grounds, the nearby woods, and the swamp edges. They found nothing. No tracks, no torn clothing, no signs of an accident. Wade Parsons had simply vanished as thoroughly as if he had never existed. The disappearance troubled Greer because it represented a loss of control. In the social order of the plantation, white overseers occupied a position of absolute authority. The idea that one could simply disappear suggested a breakdown in that order, a crack in the facade of invulnerability that maintained the entire system. Greer sent a message to Jeremiah Calhoun in Savannah, reporting Parsons's absence and speculating that the man might have gotten drunk and wandered off, possibly falling into the river or becoming lost in the swamps. With carefully concealed satisfaction, the enslaved population responded to Parsons's disappearance. Parsons had been particularly cruel, known for whipping enslaved people for the smallest infractions and for targeting young women with sexual violence. His absence was a blessing, though no one dared speak this thought aloud. What they did whisper about in the quiet hours after the overseers had retired was the fact that Silas had been working in a rice field within sight of Parsons's last known location, and that several people had seen Parsons yelling at Silas the afternoon before his disappearance. 3 weeks passed. The rhythm of plantation life continued with one fewer overseer, a situation that increased the workload on the remaining white men but didn't fundamentally alter the brutal reality of enslaved existence. Greer hired a replacement, a young man named Daniel Carmichael, who came from a farming family in Greene County and was eager to prove himself capable of managing enslaved labor. On February 3, Daniel Carmichael disappeared. The circumstances mirrored Parsons's vanishing so closely that Greer felt genuine alarm for the first time. Carmichael had been supervising work in the rice fields during the afternoon. When the enslaved workers were called back to quarters at sunset, Carmichael wasn't with them. A search of his cabin revealed the same details as Parsons's disappearance: a half-eaten meal, personal belongings undisturbed, no signs of violence or struggle. It was as if Carmichael had simply stopped existing mid-thought. This time, Greer expanded the search. He brought in men from neighboring plantations, experienced trackers who knew the swamps and forests. They found nothing. The slave patrols that regularly roamed the county roads were notified to watch for any suspicious activity. County authorities were quietly informed, though no official report was filed. Planters preferred to handle such matters privately to avoid any appearance of vulnerability in their control over enslaved populations. The disappearances created a tension that hung over the Calhoun plantation like humidity before a storm. The remaining overseers began traveling in pairs, unwilling to be alone in areas where enslaved workers were present. They carried their weapons constantly and watched the enslaved population with increased suspicion. Random beatings increased as the overseers attempted to reassert control through intensified violence. The enslaved people endured this escalation with the grim resignation of people who understood that their survival depended on appearing compliant while revealing nothing. Silas continued his work in the rice fields with the same silent intensity he had displayed since arriving at the plantation. His skin bore the scars of constant sun damage and frequent beatings, creating a pattern of pale scar tissue over pink burns that gave him an even more unsettling appearance. The other enslaved workers began to avoid him, not out of dislike, but out of fear that association with him might draw the overseer's suspicion. There was something about Silas that made people uncomfortable, a stillness in his manner, a complete absence of the fear that governed everyone else's behavior. On March 19, 2 overseers disappeared on the same night. Robert Finch and a man named George Talbot had been assigned to night watch duty, a rotation that Greer had implemented after Carmichael's disappearance. They were supposed to patrol the area around the slave quarters and the main plantation buildings, watching for any suspicious activity. When morning came, both men were gone. Their rifles were found leaning against a tree at the edge of the cypress grove, positioned carefully as if someone had placed them there deliberately. A search of the grove itself revealed nothing but dense vegetation and dark water. Thomas Greer's response to the third and fourth disappearances revealed the depth of his alarm. He sent an urgent message to Jeremiah Calhoun demanding that the owner return to the plantation immediately, describing the situation as critical and requiring direct intervention. While waiting for Calhoun's arrival, Greer implemented a series of measures designed to prevent further disappearances and to uncover whoever or whatever was responsible. All enslaved people were confined to their quarters from sunset to sunrise with armed guards posted at every entrance. Anyone leaving the quarters for any reason would be shot without warning. The overseers worked in groups of 3 or more, never alone, and maintained constant visual contact with each other. Greer personally interrogated dozens of enslaved people, using torture when he deemed it necessary, trying to extract information about who might be responsible for the disappearances. These interrogations revealed nothing useful. Either the enslaved population genuinely knew nothing, or their silence was impenetrable. The white community of Burke County began to take notice of the situation, though the full extent of the disappearances remained concealed. Planters discussed the matter quietly at social gatherings, speculating about runaway slaves turned violent or possible outside interference from abolitionists. The presence of active resistance to slavery was a nightmare scenario for Georgia's planter class in 1854. The memory of Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia remained vivid even 23 years after it occurred, a reminder that the enslaved population could and would fight back if given opportunity and leadership. Some planters suggested that the disappearances might be related to the tensions that were building across the South over the question of slavery's expansion. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, passed just weeks before the first disappearance on the Calhoun plantation, had inflamed sectional tensions and prompted increased abolitionist activity. There were rumors of underground railroad networks extending deeper into Georgia than previously thought, and of northern agitators working to incite slave rebellions. These theories failed to explain why the disappeared men left no trace, but they provided a framework for understanding the situation that didn't require planters to confront the more disturbing possibility that someone or something was hunting white overseers with complete impunity. Jeremiah Calhoun arrived at his plantation on March 25, accompanied by his personal secretary and 2 hired guards. Calhoun was a thin man of 56, dressed in the fine clothing that marked his social standing, visibly uncomfortable in the rural setting of his own property. He had inherited wealth and enslaved people but had never developed the stomach for the actual mechanics of plantation management. That distaste had led him to rely entirely on overseers like Greer, allowing them free rein to manage his human property however they saw fit. The meeting between Calhoun and Greer took place in the plantation's main house, a substantial structure that had been built by Calhoun's father in the 1820s. Greer laid out the facts of the disappearances with military precision, dates, locations, circumstances, and the complete absence of evidence or witnesses. He also shared his growing conviction that someone among the enslaved population was responsible, though he admitted he had no proof and no suspects. "I've managed enslaved people for 20 years, Greer told Calhoun. "I know when they are planning something. There's a feeling in the air, a tension you can sense. But this is different. They are scared. Truly scared, but not of us. They are scared of something else." Calhoun suggested bringing in the county sheriff and organizing an official investigation. But Greer immediately opposed this idea. An official investigation would create a public record of the plantation's inability to maintain order, potentially devaluing Calhoun's property and creating legal complications. The planter class maintained its authority partly through the illusion of complete control. Admitting that 4 white men had disappeared without explanation would shatter that illusion. Instead, they agreed on a different approach. Greer would hire additional overseers from outside Burke County, men who wouldn't be aware of the previous disappearances and who could provide fresh eyes on the situation. They would also implement a reward system, offering freedom to any enslaved person who provided information leading to the capture of whoever was responsible for the disappearances. This latter strategy was calculated to divide the enslaved population, turning them against each other in the hope that someone would betray useful information. The new overseers arrived in early April. 3 men recruited from rice plantations in South Carolina, all experienced in managing enslaved labor under harsh conditions. Their names were Marcus Sloan, Raymond Dodd, and Henry Fletcher. Greer briefed them on the plantation's operations but deliberately omitted any mention of the disappearances, telling them only that the plantation had recently experienced management turnover and required additional supervision. For 2 weeks, nothing unusual occurred. The presence of new overseers and the increased security measures seemed to have stabilized the situation. Greer began to relax slightly, believing that the disappearances might have been the work of an outsider who had been frightened off by the enhanced security. Calhoun prepared to return to Savannah, satisfied that his property was now under proper control. On April 22, Marcus Sloan didn't return from the morning inspection of the rice fields. The discovery of Sloan's disappearance triggered panic among the remaining overseers. The pattern was breaking. Sloane had disappeared during daylight hours while enslaved workers were present and under supervision. This suggested a boldness that made the previous disappearances seem almost cautious by comparison. Greer immediately ordered a lockdown of the entire plantation. All work stopped. Every enslaved person was confined to the quarters under armed guard. The remaining overseers, along with Calhoun's hired guards, conducted a systematic search of every structure and area on the plantation grounds. They found something this time. In the cypress grove, approximately half a mile from the rice fields where Sloane had been working, searchers discovered a clearing that showed signs of recent disturbance. The ground had been torn up in places, and there were marks in the soft earth that might have been drag marks, though the swampy conditions made precise interpretation impossible. More disturbing were the marks on several cypress trees. Deep gouges in the bark, as if something had been scraped against the wood with considerable force. Some of the gouges showed traces of what appeared to be blood, though the amount was minimal, and the condition made testing impossible. Greer ordered the search expanded to cover the entire cypress grove and the swamp areas beyond. This proved difficult. The terrain was treacherous with hidden sinkholes, dense vegetation, and water that could reach waist deep without warning. The searchers worked in groups, calling out to each other constantly to maintain contact. They found nothing else of significance. If Sloane had met his fate in that clearing, his body had been moved or hidden with remarkable effectiveness. The enslaved population was interrogated again, this time with increased violence. Greer's restraint, such as it was, had eroded completely. He personally oversaw torture sessions designed to extract information using techniques that left permanent physical damage. Several enslaved people died during these interrogations, their bodies buried in unmarked graves at the edge of the plantation. The survivors revealed nothing useful because they genuinely had nothing to reveal. Whatever was happening, the enslaved population was as ignorant of the details as Greer himself. One interrogation, however, produced an interesting detail. An elderly enslaved man named Caesar, who had worked on the plantation for 40 years and whose age had reduced him to light duties, mentioned that he had seen Silas near the cypress grove on several occasions. This observation wasn't particularly meaningful. Many enslaved people had reason to be near the grove for various work-related purposes. But when pressed, Caesar admitted that he had seen Silas entering the grove after dark during the hours when all enslaved people were supposed to be confined to their quarters. Greer immediately ordered Silas brought to the main house for interrogation. The guards who went to fetch him found Silas in his assigned sleeping area in the quarters, lying on the rough wooden platform that served as his bed. He offered no resistance when they bound his hands and led him across the plantation grounds. His pale skin showed fresh bruises and healing wounds from recent beatings, and his eyes watered constantly in the afternoon sunlight, but his expression remained neutral, almost serene. The interrogation took place in a storage shed adjacent to the main house, location Greer preferred for such activities because it was far enough from the slave quarters that screams wouldn't be overheard. Calhoun was present along with Raymond Dodd and Henry Fletcher, the two remaining overseers who had arrived from South Carolina. Silas was stripped to the waist and chained to a post in the center of the shed, his arms pulled above his head in a position designed to cause maximum discomfort. Greer began with questions delivered in a deceptively calm voice. "You've been seen entering the cypress grove at night. Why?" Silas remained silent, his eyes focused on something beyond Greer's shoulder. 5 overseers have disappeared from this plantation in less than 4 months, Greer continued. "You arrived here shortly before the first disappearance. That's an interesting coincidence." Still silence. Greer nodded to Dodd, who stepped forward with a leather whip. The beating that followed was systematic and brutal, designed to inflict maximum pain without causing immediately life-threatening injuries. Dodd had experience with such work and understood how to pace the punishment to avoid killing the subject too quickly. Silas's back was torn open, blood running down his pale skin in stark red streams. He made no sound. His eyes never left that distant point he had fixed upon, and his body remained still except for the involuntary jerks caused by the whip's impact. After 20 lashes, Greer stopped the beating and tried questions again. Silas's silence remained absolute. They resumed the whipping, delivering another 20 lashes that left Silas's back a raw mass of torn flesh. Still, He made no sound. The men in the shed began to feel uncomfortable. There was something deeply unsettling about someone who could endure such punishment without crying out, without begging, without showing any sign that the pain affected him at all. "He's not human," Fletcher muttered. "No man can take that without making a sound." Greer, frustrated and increasingly unnerved, tried a different approach. He had Silas taken down from the post and secured in a sitting position. Then he ordered hot coals brought from the kitchen fires. The torture that followed involved pressing heated metal against Silas's skin, targeting areas that would produce intense pain without causing immediately fatal injuries. The smell of burning flesh filled the shed. Silas's pale eyes watered more heavily, but whether from pain or simply from the smoke was impossible to determine. He didn't scream. He didn't speak. He barely moved. After 2 hours of this, even Calhoun, who had limited stomach for the realities of slavery, couldn't watch anymore and left the shed. Greer, Dodd, and Fletcher continued for another hour before finally stopping, not because they had gotten information, but because they were physically exhausted and psychologically disturbed by Silas's complete lack of response. They had him dragged back to the slave quarters, unconscious from blood loss and trauma, but somehow still alive. That night, April 22nd, 2 more overseers disappeared. Raymond Dodd and Henry Fletcher, the men who had participated in Silas's torture, were both assigned to guard duty at the main house. They were armed with rifles and positioned on opposite sides of the building with instructions to call out to each other every 15 minutes to confirm they were alert and present. At midnight, Dodd called out. Fletcher responded. At 12:15, Dodd called out again. There was no response from Fletcher. Dodd immediately raised the alarm, and within minutes, Greer and the remaining guards were searching the area. They found Fletcher's rifle leaning against the wall of the main house, exactly where he had been standing. His hat lay on the ground nearby. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks leading away. Fletcher had simply vanished. The searchers fanned out across the plantation grounds, calling Fletcher's name and searching every building and area they could access in the darkness. 2 hours later, when they returned to the main house to regroup and plan a more systematic dawn search, they discovered that Raymond Dodd was also gone. His rifle remained at his post. His position showed no signs of disturbance. 7 white men had now disappeared from the Calhoun plantation in less than 4 months. Dawn on April 23 revealed a plantation descending into chaos. The remaining white men, Thomas Greer, Jeremiah Calhoun, his secretary, and the 2 hired guards, gathered in the main house and barricaded themselves inside. They were outnumbered by the enslaved population 200 to 5, and the careful system of surveillance and control that had maintained order had completely collapsed. The situation was unprecedented in Greer's experience. Individual slave rebellions happened occasionally. Escape attempts were common. Even murders of overseers occurred on rare occasions. But this systematic elimination of authority figures was something else entirely. Cautiously, the enslaved population emerged from their quarters, uncertain what the new day would bring. The normal routine of forced labor didn't resume because there was no one to enforce it. The guards at the quarters had abandoned their posts during the night, retreating to the relative safety of the main house. For the first time in memory, the enslaved people of the Calhoun plantation experienced a morning without someone telling them what to do. Delilah, the cook, was one of the first to realize that Silas was missing. His sleeping area in the quarters was empty. The rough blanket that had covered him was soaked with blood from his torture wounds, but without any sign of the man himself. Several people had checked on him during the night, concerned that he might die from his injuries. As recently as 4 hours before dawn, someone had seen him lying there, barely conscious but breathing. Now he was gone. The disappearance of Silas sparked intense debate among the enslaved population. Some argued that he had finally died from his injuries and that someone had secretly removed the body to avoid questions. Others believed he had somehow recovered enough to walk away, perhaps fleeing into the swamps to escape further torture. A smaller group, mostly older people who had lived through decades of slavery and had developed a deep skepticism about coincidence, believed something else entirely. They believed that Silas had been the one responsible for the overseer's disappearances and that his removal from the quarters meant the nightmare was entering its final phase. Inside the main house, Greer and Calhoun debated their options. Calhoun wanted to abandon the plantation immediately, returning to Savannah and sending federal troops to restore order. Greer argued that abandoning the property would result in the total loss of Calhoun's human cattle. The enslaved people would scatter into the swamps and forests, heading for free territory or simply disappearing into Georgia's backcountry where they might survive as fugitives for years. The enslaved population represented an investment of over $100,000, a fortune that Calhoun couldn't afford to lose. The compromise they reached was to send the secretary and one guard to Savannah with urgent messages for both federal authorities and neighboring planters, requesting immediate military intervention and assistance. The secretary left late in the morning, riding hard for Savannah with a letter from Calhoun describing the situation in carefully edited terms. He mentioned that several overseers had disappeared under mysterious circumstances but omitted the more disturbing details that might suggest a complete loss of control. That afternoon, while the secretary was still miles from Savannah, Greer made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He decided to address the enslaved population directly, using a combination of threats and promises to try to restore some semblance of order. He had the remaining guard fire several rifle shots into the air to gather the enslaved people to the area in front of the main house. When they had assembled, a crowd of over 200 people, some curious, others fearful, all uncertain about what was happening, Greer emerged onto the front porch of the main house and spoke to them. "I know someone here knows what's been happening," Greer began, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. 7 white men have disappeared from this plantation. That can't happen without someone knowing something. I'm offering freedom, legal, documented freedom, to anyone who provides information leading to whoever is responsible. You'll be given papers and transportation to wherever you want to go. No tricks, no lies. Real freedom. The crowd remained silent. Greer continued, shifting from offer to threat. "If no one comes forward, I'll burn these quarters to the ground with everyone in them. I'll see every last one of you dead before I let this plantation fall. You have until sundown to make your choice." The threat was likely empty. Greer couldn't kill 200 people without bringing down exactly the kind of official scrutiny that Calhoun was trying to avoid. But the enslaved population had no way of knowing that. They dispersed back to their quarters, gathering in small groups to discuss what to do. The general consensus was that no one knew anything useful. Silas had kept to himself, revealing nothing of his intentions, if indeed he had been responsible for anything. The disappearances had occurred without witnesses or evidence. There was nothing to tell, even if someone had wanted to claim the offered freedom. As afternoon faded toward evening, a young enslaved man named Caleb approached the main house. Caleb was 16 years old, quick-minded and desperate to escape slavery by any means available. He claimed to have information about the disappearances and requested permission to speak with Greer privately. The overseer, hopeful that his threat had worked, agreed. Caleb was brought into the main house and led to the room where Greer, Calhoun, and the remaining guard had established their command center. "I seen something," Caleb said, his eyes downcast in the submissive posture that enslaved people learned early. "I seen the pale one, Silas, going into the cypress grove at night multiple times, and I seen him carrying things." "What kinds of things?" Greer demanded. "Couldn't tell for certain in the dark, sir," Caleb replied. "But they looked like bundles, heavy bundles that he carried over his shoulder. He was heading deep into the swamp where the ground gets too wet for most folks to go." This information aligned with what Caesar had reported earlier about Silas entering the grove. Greer felt a surge of vindication. His instinct about Silas had been correct. The albino slave was somehow responsible for the disappearances, though the mechanism remained unclear. How could one man, subjected to constant surveillance and regular beatings, manage to abduct and kill 7 armed overseers without leaving evidence? "Can you lead us to where he went?" Greer asked Caleb. "Yes, sir," Caleb replied. "I can show you the path he took, but we'd need to go before full dark. Once night comes, that swamp ain't safe for nobody who don't know it proper." Greer considered this carefully. The sun was already low on the horizon, giving them perhaps an hour of usable daylight. Going into the cypress grove with limited visibility was dangerous, but waiting until morning meant another night of vulnerability. He made his decision quickly. "We go now. All of us." He turned to Calhoun. "You'll stay here with the doors barred. If we're not back by dawn, ride for Savannah yourself." Greer, the remaining guard, a man named Patterson, and Caleb prepared for the expedition. They armed themselves with rifles, knives, and a length of rope. Greer also brought a torch, though he hoped they wouldn't need it before returning. As they left the main house, dozens of enslaved people watched from the quarters, their faces unreadable in the fading light. Caleb led them toward the cypress grove, moving with the confident stride of someone who knew the terrain. The path he followed was barely visible, a slight depression in the ground that wound between massive cypress trees draped with Spanish moss. The air grew thick with moisture and the smell of decaying vegetation. Water began appearing in pools, then as a continuous shallow layer covering the ground. They were entering the deep swamp. "How much farther?" Greer asked after they'd walked for nearly 20 minutes. "Not far now, sir. There's a clearing up ahead, maybe 200 yards more." The light was failing rapidly. Greer decided they would investigate the clearing and then return immediately rather than risk being caught in the swamp after dark. They pressed forward, their boots squelching in the muddy water. Strange sounds echoed through the grove, bird calls, the splash of something moving through water, the creak of tree branches swaying in wind they couldn't feel down at ground level. The clearing, when they reached it, was larger than Greer expected. It was a roughly circular area, perhaps 50 feet across, where the cypress trees gave way to open space. The ground was slightly elevated here, creating a dry island in the surrounding wetland. And in the center of this clearing stood a structure that made all three men stop in their tracks. It was a framework built from cypress branches lashed together with what appeared to be strips of leather. The structure stood about 8 foot tall and formed a rough rectangular shape. Hanging from this framework were 9 objects that Greer's mind initially refused to identify. They swayed slightly in the breeze, and as he forced himself to look more carefully, understanding came with a wave of nausea. They were skins. Human skins, stretched and cured like leather hides, still showing the recognizable features of faces, the texture of body hair, the shape of hands and feet. 9 complete human skins, carefully preserved and displayed like trophies. Greer recognized Wade Parsons by a distinctive scar on his left arm. Robert Finch's tattoo, an anchor he'd gotten during a brief stint in the Merchant Marine, was clearly visible on one of the suspended skins. The others were harder to identify individually, but the count matched perfectly. 9 overseers. All of them here? Patterson vomited immediately, the sound loud in the grove's unnatural silence. Caleb stood frozen, his eyes wide with horror. Greer felt his hand shaking as he raised his rifle, scanning the clearing for any sign of threat. This was far worse than murder. This was something that reached beyond the normal bounds of human violence into territory that seemed almost inhuman in its calculated cruelty. "We need to leave," Patterson gasped, wiping his mouth. "We need to get out of here right now." Before Greer could respond, Caleb spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "He's here. He's been here the whole time." Greer spun around, following Caleb's gaze. At the edge of the clearing,